Western interests and so on. So it's something, the conditions and the systems have always been in place. And there's just been sort of different moments, I think, of expressions. And it's not as if right-wing ideology can't exist on its own, but we always have to ask about, well, what are the material conditions that lend itself to this kind of ideology, or else how can we confront it? And it's the same thing like when I lived in India and learned more about the violence of the caste system. And I was there during the rise of the Hindutva when Modi was elected, which is a horrific sort of like fascist, popular and state fascist movement that is targeting Muslims and lower caste people and poor people with impunity. And the discussion that was brought to me was, well, look at the colonial economy. And in the 30s, pre-independence, and how did that help sort of facilitate kind of maintaining this caste system in the post-independence period? So those are really important questions to ask. And then if we look at the fascism that we're dealing with today, it's anti-black, it's anti-indigenous, it's anti-indigenous sovereignty, it's anti-Muslim, it's anti-woman, it's anti-Semitic, it's anti-poor, it's anti-trans, it's heteronormative. But it's also anti-communist. It's very anti-communist and anti-left because they also need to oppose the forces that are going to be able to confront this. And that's why for many, many years, state authoritarian forces were really concentrating on getting rid of leftist and communist movements around the world, whether they be in Latin America, or they be in Indonesia, or they be in the Middle East, helping to prop up Islamicist ideology as a way to thwart sort of left forces that were there. That's not the whole story, but that's a big part of the story. And so when we're thinking about that, so we think about then the forces of popular fascism and how it reflects that, but we have to continue to look at what are the building blocks, the features of state fascism, right? State authoritarianism as it's always existed, and how is it different? And it's not that it's not that it wasn't globalized before, but it's increasingly globalized now. And really, what we're looking at in a lot of ways are global regimes of national security, global regimes of militarized killings of poor people, or people accused of being criminals, or people accused of being members of gangs, or people, and that goes hand in hand with mass incarceration, right? But in particularly this narrative of anti-terrorism and the war on terrorism, and this perpetual war, which not only has been sort of declaring people to be terrorists now with the MST in Brazil, which Jeff is going to talk about, right? So sort of creating this narrative that we're all terrorists. We used to be communists, and now we're all terrorists, or we're criminals, or we're gang members, right? And how that is being used not only to label us and imprison us, but to justify also our killings, right? To create impunity to go after us, right? And we've seen, we just had a workshop on state violence earlier, and I want to uplift something important that Andrea Ritchie had said, was that when we look closely at the policing of women and trans people, that we have a very sort of intimate and well-informed understanding of how the police state works. And I want to just sort of talk about that. If you look at the history, particularly of the collusion of an ethno-nationalist fascist state like Israel, who is supported by an ideology called Zionism, and it's not just embodied in Netanyahu, it is embodied in the state of Israel and how it was founded. If you look at their history of colluding with military dictatorships in Latin America, of supporting white South African apartheid regime, you see this history of this state authoritarian collusion. And the United States and Israel have a very strong history of doing this. And if you look at legal cases in particular, I want to name the ones that I think are key to understanding that. It's Los Angeles 8, it's the Rasmia All-Day case, it's the Holy Land Foundation case in Texas, it's the Muhammad Salah case in Chicago, which the People's Law Office was a part of. If you look closely at these cases, you will see deep, deep collusion between national security forces in the United States and national security forces in Israel to basically not only target Palestinians or Arabs or any solidarity activists who even try to give just charity to Palestinian widows and children, but even try to give any kind of support to that struggle. The targeting, the surveillance, the infiltration, the targeting, and then the vicious prosecution. And the case of the LA 8 case, it was 20 years, and they 1 Kenyan and 7 Palestinians, who and they began going after them with the McConnell-Karen Act, which was a McCarthyist anti-communist act. And then, when that didn't work, they used the effective terrorism with effective anti-death penalty and anti-terrorism act of the Clinton era. When that didn't work, they used the Patriot Act, right? And in many ways, it was kind of a testing ground for how they can go after immigrants. Like, because it's not just going to be the Palestinians, right? How they can go after immigrants for having associations with these really important liberation anti-colonial movements abroad. And I just want to also just uplift the Mohammed Salah case, because I was an organizer in Chicago around that time. That case was predicated on actual supposed confession that Salah had made in an Israeli prison under torture, and the amount of money and the amount of time that the United States government used to allow Israel to have its own defense in the U.S. courtroom is just absolutely incredible. So I encourage you to kind of look at some details of that case and talk to the lawyers who are part of that. But the last thing I want to say is that, it's not just about state actors. There are a lot of non-state actors that are part of this coalition. And when I'm talking about U.S. and Israel, I'm talking about non-state actors like the Anti-Defamation League or AIPAC. And they also are increasingly in associations with Hizbullah ideology-led organizations in the United States as well. And they are part of helping to facilitate these blacklists that lead to surveillance and infiltration. They are part of this police relations movement. And in fact, ADL was instrumental last year in sending ICE deputy director to Israel to sort of get trained to help them. I'm not saying that the United States needs Israel to show them how to be a police state, but I'm just showing that this is sort of increasingly globalized. So that's all I want to say.
Now Jeff Frank is going to join us and was asked to join us yesterday. So thank you so much. Jeff is going to bring some of the very recent developments in Brazil through his long-time work with the Atlantis People's Movement and workers there. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. So the question that I was asked to answer is, how did the neo-fascist Jair Bolsonaro get elected in Brazil last Sunday? So to do that, I'm going to have to give you about 15 years of Brazilian history, so I'm going to talk really fast because I need to cover this. So in 2002, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known as Lula, was elected president. He's from the Workers' Party, longtime activist, and union activist, and activist against the military dictatorship during that time period. He and his allies in Congress, and the Workers' Party allies in Congress, immediately brought vast social programs to the Brazilian people to aid the poor and working class, such as Zero Fome, which is no hunger, and Bolsa Família, which is a cash transfer program. These programs, during the course of Lula's 8 years in power, lifted about 30 million Brazilians out of abject poverty. That's 30 million people out of a population of about 210 million. So you can see how vast the programs were and how much benefit they had. However, there's always a price to pay. And the price to pay in Brazil was that the quid pro quo for these social programs, the implicit deal made with the Brazilian bourgeoisie and international capital, is that they were going to disrupt the commodity export economy of Brazil. So Brazil exports, their three top exports are soybeans, iron ore, and raw sugar, and there's a long list after that. And that export economy was booming and brought a lot of wealth into Brazil during Lula's administration. Additionally, Wall Street decided that Brazil had become a good bet. It was known as BRIC, the BRIC economies, the rising economies, and they loosened up capital. So there's a lot of cheap money in Brazil for the working class and middle class to start acquiring refrigerators, homes, et cetera, et cetera. So the economy was booming, unemployment was low, and everybody was happy. Then in October of 2006, vast offshore oil deposits were discovered in Brazil. It's estimated that there's been 100 billion barrels of oil in these deposits, which, to give you some perspective, that's about 40% of Saudi Arabia's proven reserves. But of course, this led to vast scramble by the private sector to get contracts in order to to exploit this, contracts for building pipeline, contracts for offshore oil platforms, et cetera, et cetera. Since the oil is controlled by Petrobras, which is a state oil company, majority owned by the state, contracts are led then by the government of Brazil. Therefore, it became endemic, corruption became endemic in order to bribe Brazilian congresspeople and government officials to get these contracts because they were so lucrative. It's estimated there was almost $1 billion in bribes paid over about a 7-8 year period. This led to what was known as the Operation Car Wash scandal, which engulfed not only members of the Workers' Party, but almost everybody, every party in the Brazilian legislature. In fact, it's estimated that 60% of Brazil's 594 members of Congress face serious charges such as bribery, electoral fraud, illegal deforestation, kidnapping, and homicide. In 2010, Dilma Rousseff was elected. Their term limits in Brazil, two consecutive terms is the limit. So she was elected with 56% of the vote, and she was reelected in 2014 with 51% of the vote. Again, she's a Workers' Party candidate. However, in 2002, Brazil began to enter its worst recession in history. And by 2014, they were in deep recession. What happened, of course, was that the worldwide recession led to a fall off in the demand for commodities, particularly by China, which is one of Brazil's major trading partners, and a tightening of credit. So that the economy from 2014 to 2016 declined 8%, and unemployment grew by 76% to about 12.9 million people, or 12.6% of the unemployment rate. So what's a capitalist going to do in those situations? What's the world economy going to do? What's the international capital and local capital do? Well, their playbook is the neoliberal adjustments. In other words, austerity programs. Cut health programs, cut those social programs that have been so beneficial to Brazil. But there's a problem. The PT still the Workers' Party still controlled the government, and that was a core. Those social programs, cutting those were something even a corrupt Workers' Party couldn't do. So they launched a program, Globo Television. Globo is the media conglomerate in Brazil. Launched a program to encourage protests. So think of Fox News and the Tea Party protests. So it's a similar sort of thing. They launched protests which had two elements. It was a middle-class protest, an upper-middle-class protest on the one side, and it unleashed violent neo-fascist protests on the other side, which attacked the counter-protests. So there was a fair amount of violence. Dilma was impeached in 2016, just as an aside to show you what kind of a person Bolsonaro is, that when he impeached, his dedication for impeachment was on behalf of the colonel who had personally tortured Dilma when she was held captive during the military dictatorship. So the successor government, led by Michel Temer, who's still the president, attempted and failed to implement a neoliberal program agenda. They tried to curtail Social Security, and that failed due to a general strike, which was successful. But they were able to impeach Dilma and get rid of her. So the next step was they had to get rid of Lula, who was still incredibly popular and indicated that he would win in the first round of the 2018 elections. Lula was corruption charges were ginned up against Lula. It violated all the constitutional norms, so that in essence he was taken out of the picture. The electoral court said that he was done too. So Bolsonaro stepped in. Bolsonaro had been a marginal character in Brazilian history. He was a deputy congressman who was invited on talk shows mainly because of the outrageous things he would say would gin up ratings. But what he seized on was two things: the corruption and secondly, the high crime rate. Brazil had 64,000 homicides in 2017. That's compared to 17,200 in the United States in 2017. And that's with a population of 210 million versus 330 million. So Bolsonaro rode those and became popular. He wasn't the first choice of the Brazilian electorate, Brazilian elites. But he said he did three things that made him palatable. One is he demanded curtailment of labor rights. He said labor can choose between losing its rights and having employment, or keeping its rights and having unemployment. He declared the MST a terrorist organization, which the Brazilian landed elite were words that they wanted to hear. And he also said there's no such thing as indigenous reserves or quilombos. But the thing that really cemented him with international capital was the naming of a fellow named Paulo Guedes as his economic advisor and minister. And Guedes is an economist trained at the University of Chicago, so you understand what that means. Also, there was a social media campaign and lots of violence as part of that. So Bolsonaro won. I can give you more on the violence, but the one thing you have to understand about Bolsonaro's victory was there were 66 million Brazilians that voted for Bolsonaro. There was 45 million that voted for the Workers' Party candidate, Haddad, but there was 31 million ballots that were not marked for president at all. So that's about 22% of the electorate that didn't vote for president because they were so disgusted by both candidates.
Thank you. So we're obviously hearing a lot of parallels across different parts of the country and a lot of collaboration. I wanted to just quickly ask you all to reflect a little bit and pull out a little bit specifically the sort of heteronormative patriarchy and misogyny that is such an important vehicle for fascism and state authoritarianism. So whichever of you would want to answer to that briefly, and then I know we all want to move to resistance, but it'd be good to hear that.
So this is the trademark of the Bolsonaro. What has become the Bolsonaro: homophobic, misogynist, transphobic. He is as well as admiration for the military dictatorship which ruled Brazil from 1964 to 1985. In fact, he said that the problem with the military dictatorship is that it wasn't harsh enough. It tortured people instead of killing them. He said about 30,000 more deaths would have cemented them in power for another generation or so. Homophobic, he says if he sees two men kissing in the street, he's going to beat them both up. He says if your child exhibits homosexual tendencies, that take the leather to them, in other words, beat them until they stop. I can go on and on. He once told a congresswoman that he wouldn't rape her because she wasn't worth it, and right to her face in Congress.
I would like to speak a little bit about domestically what we've seen, and I think many of us have been concerned about. Specifically, after the hearings confirming Justice Kavanaugh to the U.S. Supreme Court, and some of us now has jurisprudence that sort of conforms to a lot of the concerns that I think that we're raising right now around maintaining the rule of the patriarchy and white supremacy, and which we, I think, can reflect on in the U.S. Supreme Court as being based on the foundation of this country upholding white male land ownership, right? But I think this is reflective also in the fascist tendencies in this country right now, and the things that are tied to the men's rights movement that have also caused mass shootings as a form of terror based in the expectations of white male privilege, right? And we've seen this over and over. We've heard this from white supremacist groups around the role of women and the limitations of feminism or the vilification of feminism. And I think we can all agree that the National Warriors Guild stands strongly against all of that.
The deployment of misogyny and patriarchy in Duterte's fascist dictatorship is very peculiar and very blatant. in the context that he's in, right? The Philippines is a mostly Catholic country. Over 80% of the people of the Philippines are Catholic. Divorce is also illegal in the Philippines. The reproductive health bill, in many versions of it, has failed over and over again. And Duterte, was pro-woman at some point, but his public rhetoric has been just terribly disgusting, and I want to warn folks about what I'm about to share. He has constantly used rape jokes in public statements, official statements, and justifying the use of sexual violence for conquest. And he specifically has it out for women red fighters from the New People's Army, and has declared that because them joining the revolution and fighting for the resistance is diametrically opposed to their natural disposition. And so he said, because they're useless, basically, because they're fighting me, then I advocate for the army to shoot them in the vagina. So constantly making macho, fascist, disgusting remarks that is emboldening the feudal patriarchy that was historically already occurs in the Philippines.
See, violence against Palestinians have always been gendered. And I want to sort of bring attention to a statement that was made by an Israeli justice minister who is a woman by the name of Adely, who I think it was during the last Gaza war where she went, I think it was on public television, and said that all Palestinians are our enemy, including the elderly, the women, and we must destroy them all. And we particularly have to focus on killing Palestinian women so they don't give birth to any Palestinian snakes. And this would sound shocking to some people, but this is a normal rhetoric in the Zionist state around Palestinian people. They have always used sexualized violence and sexualized torture in their prisons, where there are many women political prisoners. And in terms of heteronormativity, Israel and its supporters, and particularly their liberal supporters, like to uplift Israel as a bastion of rights for LGBT queer identifying folks. Fact of the matter is that Israel regularly identifies queer Palestinians and threatens to out them to their families if they're not outed if they don't spy for Israel. And so that has created a culture of mistrust against queer people in Palestinian societies. It's actually more deeper than that, but we don't have time to go that much into it. But I suggest that you look at some of the writings by folks who are involved in the pink-washing campaigns.
Thank you isn't quite the right word, but thank you for answering the question. And I think for people who heard Andrea Ritchie last night, she really was able to articulate the ways that race, class, and gender and sexuality come together. And I think, this afternoon we'll be able to hear from Rojas, who can talk a lot about state authoritarianism against the 3 million people who are incarcerated in this country, and the way that sexualized and racist violence is used as a mechanism of enforcement, not only against people in prison, but as a message to the rest of us around how we have to behave in order to not also be treated that way. So we want to move to